The shroud was not a painting, not a scorch, or not a photograph.
In 1978, a skeptical Jewish photographer walked into a royal palace in Turin, Italy, fully expecting to spend a week proving that one of history's most famous religious relics was nothing more than a clever medieval painting. He never got the chance to prove it. Instead, he spent the rest of his life trying to explain what he actually found, and he never quite could. This is the real story of Barrie Schwortz, the Shroud of Turin, and the strange, unresolved science that still surrounds a piece of linen cloth that either wrapped the body of Jesus of Nazareth or fooled the world for 700 years. Let's start with what the Shroud of Turin actually is, because most people have heard the name without ever really understanding the object itself. It's a 14-foot length of herringbone linen, faintly yellowed with age, bearing the front and back image of a man who appears to have been beaten, pierced, and crucified. The image is famously difficult to see up close. It only resolves into a recognizable human form from a distance, almost like a photographic negative. In fact, that's exactly what drew modern science to it in the first place. In 1898, an Italian lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pia took the first photograph of the shroud, and when he developed the glass negative in his darkroom, he was so startled he nearly dropped it. The negative showed a strikingly clear, almost photographic positive image of a face, as if the shroud itself were a negative, and Pia's camera had accidentally developed the real picture for the first time in more than 500 years. That single accident of chemistry is what turned the shroud from a quiet Catholic devotional object into an international scientific puzzle. 80 years later, that puzzle finally landed in the hands of a team of American scientists, and one of their photographers was a young man from Brooklyn named Barrie Schwortz. Schwortz was not a theologian, a priest, or a believer of any kind in the Christian sense. He was raised in an Orthodox Jewish household, and by his own account, he'd spent much of his adult life fairly indifferent to religious questions altogether. What he was, professionally, was one of the most technically skilled photographers in the country, the kind of specialist trusted with painstaking, high-precision documentation work. In 1977, a group of scientists calling themselves STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, began assembling a team for an unprecedented opportunity: 5 days of direct, hands-on scientific access to the actual shroud, something that had essentially never been granted to a team of secular scientists before. They needed a technical photographer who could document every fiber, every stain, every anomaly with total precision. They asked Schwortz. He later said, in interviews and in his own writing on the website he eventually built, that he thought the whole assignment was almost a joke, an all-expenses-paid trip to Italy to look at what he assumed was an obvious medieval forgery, probably painted by some clever artist trying to cash in on religious relics, a booming and often fraudulent business in the Middle Ages. He wasn't shy about saying so before he ever got on the plane. It's worth pausing on that detail, because it matters for the story. Schwortz didn't go to Turin as a believer looking for evidence to confirm what he already thought. He went as a skeptic, hired specifically because his job was to record what was there, not what anyone wanted to be there. Between October 8 and October 14, 1978, a team of roughly 30 scientists, physicists, chemists, forensic pathologists, and imaging specialists, including several from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, worked in shifts around the clock in a room adjoining Turin Cathedral. They brought equipment used in space exploration: X-ray fluorescence spectrometers, ultraviolet and infrared photography rigs, microdensitometers, and analytical devices normally reserved for lunar samples and Mars probes. It's one of the odd, true details of this story that some of the same imaging science used to study the surface of other planets was, for 5 days, turned on a piece of 1st century, or possibly 14th century, cloth. What the team did not find is almost as important as what they did. They found no evidence of any pigment, dye, paint, or applied coloring agent anywhere on the image-bearing fibers. This wasn't a passing glance. Teams ran exhaustive chemical and spectroscopic analysis specifically designed to detect trace amounts of iron oxide, ochre, or any of the dozens of pigments available to a medieval or Renaissance artist. They came up empty. There was also no evidence of brushstrokes, directional application, or any of the physical signatures you'd expect from a painted image, even a very skillfully painted one. The image itself, under magnification, turned out to be shockingly shallow. It exists only on the very topmost fibers of the linen threads, penetrating no more than a few microns deep, with no image at all on the fibers just beneath the surface or on the reverse side of the cloth. That's a strange property for any known image-making process from any era. Paint soaks in, scorching chars unevenly and deeply, and no photographic process existed in the medieval period at all. The team's chemist, Ray Rogers, and the forensic and biochemical specialists on the project, particularly John Heller and Alan Adler, a Harvard-trained biochemist with genuine expertise in blood chemistry, focused heavily on the reddish stains that mark the wrists, the scalp, the side, and the back of the figure. Adler's real, published contribution to this field is one of the more interesting and lesser sensationalized parts of the story. He and Heller argued, in peer-reviewed forensic science journals, that the stains were consistent with actual blood, showing characteristics of hemoglobin derivatives and bilirubin, and that this was consistent with a body that had undergone severe trauma before death. This is genuinely published, testable science, not folklore, and it remains one of the more scientifically interesting threads in Shroud research, because it's genuinely difficult to explain why a forger working in, say, the 1300s would go to the trouble of using real blood, applied with an anatomically accurate understanding of wound patterns that wouldn't be forensically documented for centuries. Schwortz's own account, told over decades in lectures and on the website he later founded, was that watching this unfold in real time changed something in him, not necessarily his religious beliefs, but his certainty. He went in expecting to spot an obvious fake within hours. Instead, after 5 sleepless days, the team packed up with more questions than they'd arrived with. Stirp spent the next several years analyzing their data and eventually published their findings in peer-reviewed journals, including Applied Optics, a genuinely significant, real, citable body of work. Their formal conclusion, as a team, was carefully worded and worth stating precisely, because it's often exaggerated in both directions online. They concluded that they could not identify the method by which the image was formed, and that it was not the result of any pigment or applied coloring agent that they could detect using the technology available in the early 1980s. That is a real and legitimate scientific conclusion. It is not the same thing as a scientific conclusion that the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, and Stirp never claimed that it was. We don't know how this image got here, and this is definitely a supernatural artifact are two very different sentences, and the responsible version of this story keeps them separate. Now here's where the story gets genuinely more complicated, and where a lot of Shroud content on the internet conveniently stops talking. In 1988, a decade after Stirp's investigation, the Vatican authorized a new and different kind of test, radiocarbon dating, using accelerator mass spectrometry, a technique that hadn't been mature or reliable enough to use in 1978. Small samples were cut from a corner of the shroud and independently sent to 3 separate, highly respected laboratories: the University of Oxford, the University of Arizona, and ETH Zurich. All 3 labs worked independently, without knowledge of each other's results, following blind protocols specifically designed to prevent bias. All 3 came back with strikingly consistent results. The linen dated to somewhere between roughly 1260 and 1390 AD, squarely within the medieval period, and consistent with the shroud's first verified historical appearance in France in the 1350s, when it was already being displayed and, notably, already being investigated by a local bishop who suspected the image had been painted. This is a real, peer-reviewed, published result, appearing in the journal Nature in 1989, and it is arguably the single most important piece of evidence in this entire story, which is exactly why any script or video that leaves it out isn't giving you the full picture. If the sole scientific test for the age of the cloth says medieval, honesty requires putting that front and center, not treating it as an inconvenient footnote. But it's also true, and this is the part that keeps the debate alive among serious researchers rather than settling it, that the 1988 dating has been genuinely and seriously contested, including by scientists who are not religiously motivated skeptics of the test itself. Ray Rogers, the Stirp chemist mentioned earlier, spent years after 1988 arguing that the sample used for radiocarbon dating may have come from a corner of the cloth that had been rewoven or repaired during a documented medieval restoration, after a fire damaged the shroud in 1532. Rogers published a peer-reviewed paper in 2005 in the journal Thermochimica Acta arguing that chemical analysis of the sample fibers showed evidence of cotton fibers and dye mordants inconsistent with the rest of the shroud's plain linen weave, suggesting, in his view, that the tested corner may not have been representative of the original cloth. This is a real, published, scientifically argued position, not internet speculation, though it's fair to say it remains a minority view and has been disputed by other statisticians and chemists who've re-examined his data. The honest state of play, as of today, is this. The official radiocarbon date says medieval. A real and published scientific critique questions whether that specific sample was representative of the whole cloth, and no one has been allowed to retest the shroud with modern methods since 1988, which is itself a genuine and frequently voiced frustration among researchers on every side of this debate, believers and skeptics alike. It's worth spending a little more time on the "how was the image made" question, because it's the part of this story that has generated the most genuine, ongoing scientific effort, separate from the dating controversy entirely. Over the decades since Stirp, researchers have proposed a number of physical mechanisms that might explain a shallow, non-pigmented image forming on linen fibers, and it's worth naming a few, because they show that science can't explain it isn't quite accurate. It's more that no single proposed mechanism has managed to fully reproduce every characteristic of the image at once. One widely discussed idea, associated with Stirp chemist Ray Rogers among others, involves a chemical reaction between amines released by a decomposing body and reducing sugars present on the linen from its original manufacturing and bleaching process, a version of what's called a Maillard reaction, the same basic chemistry responsible for browning in cooking. Other researchers, including physicist Giulio Fanti in Italy, have proposed that a burst of radiation or electrical discharge, sometimes described as a corona discharge effect, might be capable of producing a shallow, non-penetrating image on cellulose fibers, and have run laboratory experiments attempting to replicate shroud-like markings using high-voltage equipment. None of these experiments has yet produced a full-body image with all of the shroud's specific characteristics, its photographic negative quality, its lack of directionality, its shallow depth, and its anatomical accuracy all at once. That gap between "we have some promising partial explanations" and "we have fully replicated it" is the honest current state of the physics, and it's a very different statement than the shroud being literally impossible to explain with any known process, which is the exaggerated version that tends to spread online. The historical paper trail matters here too, and it's often left out of more sensational retellings. The shroud's documented verifiable history begins in the small French village of Lirey around 1354 or 1355, when it was displayed by a knight named Geoffroy de Charny. Almost immediately, it became a subject of controversy. A local bishop, Pierre d'Arcis, wrote a memorandum to the Pope in 1389 explicitly claiming that a previous bishop had investigated the image decades earlier and that the artist responsible had confessed to painting it. That memo is real, it survives, and it's one of the most cited pieces of evidence by scholars who favor the medieval forgery explanation, since it would place the shroud's creation right around the same window the 1988 radiocarbon dating independently produced. Shroud defenders counter that no such artist was ever named, no physical pigment has ever been detected despite that accusation, and that the d'Arcis memo may reflect ecclesiastical politics of the period rather than a verified investigation. Turin and Lirey were, after all, competing for the prestige and pilgrimage revenue that came with hosting a major relic. What's true is that there is no confirmed historical record of the shroud's existence earlier than the mid-1300s, and gaps like this are exactly what fueled decades of argument over whether a longer, undocumented history connects it back to the 1st century, or whether the 14th century really is where the story begins. Which brings us to the DNA question, the part of the story that tends to get the most sensationalized treatment online, and the part where it's most important to slow down and separate real published research from invented drama. In 2015, a team of Italian researchers led by geneticist Gianni Barcaccia, working with fiber and dust samples taken from the shroud over the years, published a real, peer-reviewed genetic study in the journal Scientific Reports. What they found was not a single, clean genetic signature pointing to one ancient population. Instead, they found a mixture, DNA sequences consistent with multiple different human populations from across a wide geographic range, including signatures that pattern with people from the Near East, but also genetic material consistent with populations from as far away as Western Europe and other regions. On the surface, that sounds exactly like the kind of thing a mystery thriller video would seize on as DNA that shouldn't be there. But the researchers themselves, in their own published conclusions, gave a fairly unglamorous, straightforward explanation. The shroud has been touched, handled, kissed, breathed on, and venerated by an enormous number of people across roughly 7 centuries of documented history in France and Italy alone, not counting whatever contact occurred before its first confirmed historical appearance. Pilgrims, clergy, restorers, and custodians from a wide range of backgrounds have had direct physical contact with the cloth for generations. A genetically mixed contamination signature, accumulated over hundreds of years of human contact, is exactly what you would statistically expect to find, not evidence of anything anomalous, let alone anything that scientists can't explain. The researchers described the DNA as too degraded and too mixed to draw firm conclusions about the origin of the cloth or the individual whose image appears on it, and that remains the sober, published, mainstream scientific position today. There is no credible peer-reviewed publication describing shroud DNA results that geneticists have refused to sign off on, or findings that research teams are hiding out of fear. That specific narrative, DNA evidence too disturbing to publish, scientists sworn to silence, does not appear anywhere in the actual scientific literature on the shroud. It's worth being direct about that, because versions of this story circulate widely online precisely because they're more dramatic than the real, published science, which is genuinely interesting enough without embellishment. So where does that leave Barrie Schwortz himself, and where does it leave the shroud? Schwortz spent the rest of his life, literally decades, trying to make the real underlying science accessible to ordinary people precisely because he'd watched how badly it got distorted in the media, in both directions. In 1996, years before most people had ever used a web browser, he founded Shroud.com, which grew into the largest and most comprehensive public archive of shroud research anywhere in the world, hosting original scientific papers, historical documents, and primary sources rather than second-hand summaries. He refused advertising and sponsorship on the site for years, wanting it to function as a neutral repository rather than a platform pushing a particular conclusion. In 2009, he formally founded the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association as a non-profit, donating his own photographic archive and decades of material to ensure it would survive him and remain publicly available. Publicly, Schwortz became known for a fairly disarming answer whenever people pressed him about his own personal beliefs. He often pointed out the strange layered irony of his position, an Orthodox Jewish man who had become one of the world's leading public experts on what many consider the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, a man who, as he liked to note, happened to share the same Middle Eastern Jewish ancestry as the figure the shroud is said to depict. He maintained, consistently, across decades of interviews, that his job was never to tell anyone what to believe, but to make sure the actual evidence, all of it, not a cherry-picked version of it, remained available for people to examine and decide for themselves. That's a genuinely rare posture in this particular corner of the internet, where nearly every voice is trying to sell you a firm conclusion in one direction or the other. Barrie Schwortz, we found new DNA on the Shroud of Turin that scientists can't explain. Barrie Schwortz passed away on June 21, 2024, in Colorado Springs, Colorado, after decades of work on this subject. Tributes from researchers on both the believing and skeptical sides of the debate described him as unusually committed to intellectual honesty, someone who was, by most accounts, more interested in preserving primary sources than in winning an argument. So here is the honest, complete picture, without the invented drama. A team of serious scientists in 1978, including a skeptical photographer who expected to debunk the shroud in an afternoon, could not identify how its image was formed using the best imaging and chemical analysis technology of the era, and found no pigment or paint. A separate, credentialed blood chemist argued the reddish stains were consistent with real blood from a severely traumatized body. A decade later, 3 independent, respected laboratories using accepted radiocarbon methods dated the cloth to the medieval period, a result that has been seriously, if not conclusively, challenged by at least one credentialed chemist on methodological grounds, without ever being retested. And decades after that, a real genetic study found a mixture of DNA consistent with centuries of ordinary human handling. Not an anomaly, and not a cover-up, whatever more sensational versions of the story might claim. None of that adds up to a tidy, satisfying answer. It adds up to something messier and, honestly, more interesting, a genuinely unresolved scientific mystery, sitting at the intersection of chemistry, forensics, radiometric dating, and history, that has occupied some of the most careful scientists of the last 50 years without producing a conclusion everyone agrees on. Is the Shroud of Turin the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, preserved